G'day legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and so far you are having a fantastic week. Now, many people have reached out to me saying, hey Willie, can you please make a video or comment on this video here titled The Hidden Reasons Ukraine is Confident About Recapturing Crimea by a Mr. Paul Warburg. And in the thumbnail of this video, it says, Crimea could fall quickly. And of course, this is very, very different to what I have been reporting in line with many other analysts and then military figures for the past years about the reality and the expense, the cost of trying to retake Crimea. So I thought that, well, why not? I'll do a reaction video to this. Now, first off the bat, regardless of what you think in this video or of Mr. Warburg himself, this is nothing aimed at himself. It's just aimed as a commentary about what he has said in this. Guys, go and support figures. Don't send any hate whichever way in this. And again, to Mr. Warburg, if you do see this, if you do happen to see this, I'm more than open to having a open, uncut, unedited podcast. If you want to push back on anything that I have said, I'm completely open to this. But we need to talk about some of videos like this and what then it says, what it does. And a lot of videos like this, they create a pseudo environment. And by creating a pseudo environment, you should read Public Opinion by Walter Lippmann. It is correct given the inputs you put. And what then Mr. Warburg says is correct if then you leave out, whether on purpose or whether unknowingly, some other key aspects to this certain part of information. So I don't believe anything he says is incorrect. I don't know if it's on purpose or not, but it is leaving out some key aspects. And one of the key aspects of this, of Crimea, is the public there, the public living there, who is living there, and the demographic change that we have seen take place, let alone militarily if it is realistic to take back these areas. And I've spoken a lot about pseudo environments getting then created, leaving out key aspects where still within that then it is correct, but these would push back against that. And I believe in this that this creates a lot of dangerous false hopes and many, many times then makes no accountability for command making decisions or politicians then making decisions. So look, let's get stuck into this by Mr. Paul Warburg, The Hidden Reasons Ukraine is Confident About Recapturing Crimea. Now, we're going to just replay this at 1.5 times speed, and we'll go through and comment as we see fit.
When it comes to the war in Ukraine, one of the objectives that a lot of people simply don't believe is actually achievable is for Ukraine to recapture Crimea from Russian hands. And when you look at the reasons that people believe this, on the surface, they at first seem to be correct.
But what I will say is these are not just people. It's not just you and I. The people looking at this and going, hey, this is unrealistic, these are brigadiers, these are colonels, these are generals, these are senior military analysts. These aren't just random people off the street looking at the map and going, that looks unrealistic.
If you're not familiar with Crimea, Crimea is a peninsula that juts out from Ukraine into the Black Sea. And owing to its geography, it is probably the single most difficult piece of Ukrainian territory to assault, and therefore the single most costly piece of territory for Ukraine to try to take back from Russian control. And
we have seen this time after time. We have spoken about this. The cost to try and retake Crimea would be extreme. And even if Ukraine was highly unlikely, but if they were successful, it would be Pyrrhic at best. And let's have a look at Crimea, because of course here we have on the map, we have Crimea, as he says, juts out a peninsula into the Black Sea, also bordered by the Sea of Azov, and I've pulled up some of, not all, of the railways on this as well.
Crimea in particular, though it is a large peninsula, can really only be accessed by land via a very narrow choke point, making it very easy to fortify, and meaning that any assault on Crimea would have to result in a lot of casualties.
So the only way to come through is currently these two entry points.
Both hitting this majorly defended fortification, and also probably consisting of beach landings in order to try to get behind those positions.
Okay, so as a former infantryman myself, and what I'd say is military analyst now, that beach landings and para landings are now not a factor in war. They're only a factor when you're talking like SF landing, small team operations, halo jumping, hey-ho jumping, swimming into shore. But as far as major landings under canopy or on the beach, you could only do this against a severely degraded adversary, and it would be that degraded at that point that you wouldn't need to actually be conducting that operation.
Because of the difficulties in recapturing this peninsula, and because a lot of military analysts have estimated extremely high casualties if Ukraine were to try to do so, a lot of people have simply written this target off as impossible.
Most people wrote this target off as impossible when Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive ultimately failed. Ukraine's 2023 counteroffensive pushed mostly in the direction of Tokmak. And what we presumed is it was pushing in this direction to Tokmak to then gain some level of fire control, if not physical control, down to the Sea of Azov, essentially splitting this into a west and eastern part, and then essentially choking these areas of Crimea and Kherson as well. What we did see, though, is that Ukraine failed to break into the first areas of the Surovikin line. And of course, to even get troops to the beginning of this, there's many very difficult, very hardened positions to even begin the battle for Crimea.
So much so, in fact, that a lot of politicians, when they are trying to set up peace terms between Ukraine and Russia, will often try to force Ukraine to simply concede control of Crimea to Russia permanently.
But these politicians, they're not doing it based on them looking at the maps. It's of advice from their military intelligence and military analysts and figures.
But this is something that Ukraine in particular has always refused to do, always claiming that they can retake Crimea eventually, and that others are simply not thinking carefully enough about the strategic situation.
What I will say is, when you're talking about information coming from one of the parties involved in the war, in this case being Crimea, of course the government is not going to say, yeah, we can't do that, we give it up. Well, Zelensky has said militarily that it is impossible to take back then the occupied territory. It has to be done other ways. But also then in the environment, like online environment here, there's people trying to have optical victories, push propaganda, create pseudo environments. Ukraine's not going to come out just due to optics and morale and propaganda and say, hey, look, that area is then unattainable to take back. So again, it's a difficult one to say that then they are seriously looking at this. In my opinion, no one in Ukraine is seriously looking at taking back Crimea, given the situation Ukraine is currently in. And this is what is left out in this. Ukraine is currently in a catastrophic manpower situation that is from deep state, who's linked in with the Ukrainian MOD, cannot conscript enough people, cannot recruit enough people, doesn't have enough weapon systems, and has protesters on the street. We need to take that into account as well.
And also simply about the importance of taking back Crimea as a strategic target, something that is absolutely worth taking back.
But the importance of a strategic target, which I agree with, is incredibly important. We need to flip that reverse and go, yes, this is why Russia initially took Crimea and why they will not just walk out, because they understand the importance of this area.
Even if it results in high casualties. So what I want to analyze...
Ukraine cannot afford high casualties. Ukraine cannot hold the front line as it is currently.
In this video is who's actually correct about this and who's actually stubborn about this. Is it actually possible?
And I am stubborn that I do not believe that Crimea is a realistic goal.
For Ukraine to recapture Crimea at a cost that makes sense without sacrificing needless human lives? Or is the recapture of Crimea simply a pipe dream by people who are hopeful but who have their head in the clouds and aren't grounded in reality? What I will say here at the forefront is very important, where a lot of politicians have come in and said the recapture of Crimea is impossible without actually looking carefully at the strategic situation Ukraine is in.
Incorrect. These politicians, well, the serious politicians are, one, they have to uphold a political standpoint, and the politicians of which we are referring to are all pro-Ukrainian politicians. And they are not saying this because they have looked at the maps and they have assessed it. It's coming from their generals behind the scenes saying, hey, Mr. or Mrs. X, this is the situation going on here.
And what type of war Ukraine is actually fighting against Russia. And when politicians come in and say that it is impossible for Ukraine to ever recapture Crimea, this is not so much a reflection of Ukraine's military capabilities, but rather a reflection of these politicians' lack of imagination and lack of long-term strategic thinking.
Long-term strategic thinking in this we have seen, due to the attritional protracted nature of the war, we have seen a lack of flexibility in Ukraine's strategic thinking, especially on the front line, tactical operations, getting enveloped, holding on to areas for too long due to attrition. And we have seen Russia slowly but surely actually move their flexibility in tactics and strategy on the front line.
Both of which Ukraine has shown they have in droves when it comes to this war against Russia, which they have used to consistently, on a very regular basis, defy expectations and surprise Western analysts.
And I agree, defying expectations and surprise analysts. But I think for the first few years, where now we actually see Ukraine reflecting more of then the Russian tactics getting developed, more so than Ukraine's at the moment, than developing their own. Same with the mobilized warfare, Lancets, etc. Lancet de Garan, apologies.
They would be toppled very quickly and have consistently been proved to be wrong.
And absolutely, I agree that, let me move that, it was on a bad frame of view, but I agree that Ukraine absolutely punched above their weight of what was expected. But what we are seeing now is we are seeing what attritional warfare against a numerically superior force does over a number of years.
With that in mind, the most important thing when it comes to analyzing the actual strategic situation of Crimea is not to look at the situation in Crimea as it exists today, but instead to look at how that situation might be changed over time and what is actually being done to change that strategic situation over time.
So this is where I push back on protracted war. Russia is winning the attritional war at the moment by any factor you want to plug into the calculus, whether it be recruitment, loss of vehicles, gain of area, whatever factor you want to put into this. If you want to put in manufacturing into that as well, Russia is winning the attritional aspect of the conflict. And as per attritional warfare, as per crossing an event horizon in warfare like this, in 6 months, in a year, that Russia will likely be in a better position to not only defend but also take ground. And as we have seen, Russia is in a better position now to defend Crimea than it was 6 months ago, than it was a year ago, significantly better than it was 2 years ago, etc. on. And that the nature of attritional war isn't linear, it isn't constant, it actually does that. It expands more quickly on that too.
And what I'm going to posit and defend in this video is that if Ukraine tried to attack Crimea today, the objective would probably be impossible to achieve.
Yes, Ukraine is significantly more weak now than it was for the 2023 counter-offensive. It may have some other capabilities, but it does not have the manpower, it does not have the morale, it does not have the belief that it can take back those areas. And we saw what happened in 23, and those positions have been continued to be reinforced since then also.
But the war in Ukraine is not going to end today. There are certain conditions that will have to happen for the war in Ukraine to end. And when those conditions are met, it will not only be possible for Ukraine to retake Crimea, but it actually might even be relatively easy and potentially even bloodless.
So take it back easy and bloodless.
So first, it's important to baseline on Crimea's strategic significance in general and how that has already completely changed over the course of the war. Because when you realize how much it has already changed, you realize how much more room there is for things to still change. Crimea at the start of the war, and really for a long time, has been seen as one of the most strategic pieces of Ukrainian territory in general. And
therefore, Russia see it as just as, if not more important, operating a large warm water port and navy.
A reason that Crimea was the first piece of Ukrainian territory that Russia ever conquered all the way back in 2014. And that's because Crimea juts out into the Black Sea and is quite easy to defend. On Crimea, which is easy to defend from land invasions, there exists one of the most important ports in the entire...
Easy to defend, very difficult to take. And we saw there's a reason why Russia took that very quickly initially. And as we know, the demographics and the way people see themselves as Ukrainian or Russian in Crimea is changing dramatically. And Ukraine is having an incredibly difficult time holding any area, even with people that see themselves as Ukrainian. Ukraine is yet to fight an area where the population themselves is then against them, at least en masse.
The Black Sea, one of the only warm water, deep water ports that is actually large enough to host an entire navy. And when you look at where Crimea is situated in the Black Sea, this positioning is also ideal in terms of being centralized for navies to carry out patrols and other types of operations. And because of these facts, Crimea has long been seen as the key to naval access to the Black Sea, and therefore the key to trade route access to and through the Black Sea as well.
So holding Crimea is for control of the Black Sea, but access in and out of the Black Sea, of course, is controlled through the Bosphorus in Turkey.
In particular, this port is also important because it is one of the few ports they have access to that is ice-free all year long. Given these facts...
given that too, it's not the only one, but also this is why Russia, for their navy as well, is investing massively in nuclear icebreaking capability for ports up in the north, of course.
A lot of people concluded that whoever controlled Crimea could ultimately control Ukraine, because they could control the comings and goings of merchant vessels bringing food and other supplies both to and from Ukrainian territory, giving a large degree of control and exertion over the Ukrainian economy. And because of this, Crimea was a major focus in the early days of the war. And due to that early focus, the strategic position and the strategic understanding of Crimea has already completely changed. And it's actually completely flipped. So now Crimea is not seen as the key to unlocking access to Ukraine, but rather controlling the rest of Ukraine is now seen as the key to unlocking access to Crimea. Early on in the war, Ukraine...
So controlling the rest of Ukraine to unlock Crimea, Crimea the key to access Ukraine. With Crimea, with that coast being occupied, is catastrophic long term.
Essentially eliminated the Russian Black Sea fleet that was stationed in Crimea, to the point that most of that fleet, if not all of that fleet, had to reposition and relocate much further away from Ukrainian territory.
Well, that's a paradox, that the fleet then moved away from the territory, but it was then essentially eliminated. The Black Sea Fleet took large losses. No one is denying that. It wasn't essentially eliminated, and it did then move, but it can't be both in this. But also, what we need to look at is that the Black Sea Fleet, from submarine to normal ship, is still firing missiles very often into Ukraine. The Black Sea Fleet has not been eliminated and is still operational, in other areas around to then the southeast as well, Sea of Azov as well.
Despite the fact that Ukraine itself did not even have a navy.
So despite the fact that Ukraine didn't even have a navy, of course, with those Beck drone boats. And there's a few aspects in this that is correct. These drone boats are going to cause absolute havoc for any navy, regardless if it is Chinese or Russian or American. One thing is the Russian Navy is the only navy with experience against these drone boats, and we have seen the effectiveness and efficiency of those drone boats reduce over time as per the ships going down, but still remaining attacks being carried out. But those are going to cause havoc against any navy. If you have 100 drone boats at a fleet with a aircraft carrier in it, that is going to be a huge problem also. But to quote Tetragami Ue, who I think is one of the best military analysts in this war, when he is saying, I still fail to see how beyond an optical victory that eliminating some ships in the Black Sea Fleet was overall a massive win. It was a propaganda win. It was an optical victory. It increased the cost for Russia. That is all true. This war, at the end of the day, is still a ground war. And there was massive focus put into sinking some of these ships following the failure of the 23 offensive to buffer that optically as well.
Ukraine was essentially able to defeat this incredibly strategic naval position by using naval drones, by using long-range missiles and other things of the sort, making it almost impossible for the Russian Black Sea Fleet to actually even operate.
No, the Black Sea Fleet is operating, and that's why those missiles are coming in from there, and that's why there are then, of course, naval aircraft operating here too. So, of course, yes, Black Sea Fleet, Sevastopol, has moved around onto mainland Russia somewhat as well. But we also see that it can operate out of the Sea of Azov and those deep channels heading back in through Rostov-on-Don into Russia as well. And we have seen a reduction in the effectiveness of those drones too.
And effectively eliminating much of the strategic importance of Crimea in general.
It showed the effectiveness and the strategic importance of Crimea. The importance and strategic importance has increased for both Ukraine and Russia to hold Crimea. Russia know that when and if this war gets settled, that there's going to be a negotiation, and Ukraine is not going to be able to continue sinking ships with drone boats if the war is settled. So that threat will then, of course, reduce.
Now, rather than Crimea being able to control what goes on in the waters around it, it turns out that what goes on in the waters around Crimea controls it. Ukraine has been able to unlock passageways to allow continued trade of its vessels through the Black Sea.
The unlocking of Ukraine to move vessels through the Black Sea, there's nothing to do with the Black Sea Fleet or then the drone boats. No, that is to do with diplomatic negotiations. Negotiations taking place in Turkey to move ships. If Russia wanted to sink these cargo ships, they absolutely could do so. Of course, there is Black Sea deals to continue moving agriculture products, etc., in and out of the Black Sea. if Russia wanted to start sinking these ships, they could do. Of course, it's going to come with massive effect because the Bosphorus then could be closed up to Russian ships doing the same thing. If Ukraine wanted to sink Russian ships, cargo ships, civilian ships moving through, and Russia wanted to do it, absolutely they could. But this is not, of course, war is politics by the means, but the politics, it was a diplomatic negotiation that allowed those ships to move in here.
Largely uninterrupted at this point. And we see that
largely uninterrupted because they know it's going to be tit for tat.
Crimea now completely flipped. The main thing that makes Crimea easy to defend, which is the fact that it is a peninsula that is only accessed through a narrow access point, also now makes Crimea an extremely vulnerable peninsula. Because the only way to get most of the water onto the Crimean Peninsula is actually through canals that have to pass through that same narrow choke point.
Okay, so yes, Russia, they know that how vulnerable this is. And he talks about water having to move through these same narrow areas into Crimea. Now, before the war began, or the full scale in 2022, Ukraine did dam and stop water flowing into Crimea. Russia then approached the UN, I believe, on 2 occasions, citing then abuse of human rights due to the flow of water, and the UN didn't hear it out both times. But also what we need to look at is that the situation was different, that Ukraine controlled up to then here. Now Russia control all the way to, I've sort of botched where my map is here, but remember those lines still there, that Russia hold through then Kherson all the way to the Dnieper River, and that Ukraine will not be able to dam in these occupied areas here. So it has then vastly changed the situation of territory to the north and the ability to create these choke points.
These canals are obviously quite easy to block and dam and basically remove the source of water.
They are easy to block and dam if you control that area. So yes, if Ukraine control between the Dnieper and then, of course, Crimea, yeah, but Ukraine doesn't, and the 23 counteroffensive showed us the almost impossibility of doing that with a more powerful army than Ukraine possessed today.
Going onto the Crimean Peninsula. There are a couple of other ways to supply Crimea, but not many. It can be supplied via the water, but we've already seen that if Ukraine wants to, they can control what goes on in the waters around Crimea.
Also, CF Azov and movement through, and if the war falls silent, the guns fall silent, those ships will move with complete free passage.
Crimea. And it can also be supplied by something called the Kerch Strait Bridge, which is the only land bridge on the eastern part of the peninsula that connects it to the rest of Russian territory, where there's a road and a railway.
So Kerch Strait Bridge in here, road and railway. But what we are forgetting is Russia know the importance of that bridge to supply Crimea. So what have they done? Well, they've spent time from Rostov-on-Don, Mariupol, Berdyansk, through creating another railway line, not shown on this map, to then supply into Crimea, and has actually taken the reliance off the Kerch Strait Bridge massively. And this was done if the Kerch Strait Bridge was taken down. The reason we know the Kerch Strait Bridge has limited strategic value, massive optical value, is there hasn't been any real massive serious attempt to take it down. If it was going to flip the script of the whole war, weapons would be delivered, policy would be altered to be able to actually take that down. Yes, we have seen it targeted, but we haven't seen serious effect on this at all.
That continue right now at this current moment to supply Crimea and give them critical access to things like fuel, food, and water, and also anything else they could want.
And Russia know about this potential, I guess, blockade of fuel and water. This is why Crimea has, and Russia has increased storage caches, etc., into Crimea in case something like that does take place. And also ferries across the Sea of Azov.
Or need. If you haven't figured it out yet, Crimea is extremely vulnerable to siege. And in particular, it's vulnerable to siege by an opponent that is patient and willing to take as much time as necessary.
It's vulnerable to siege somewhat, although limiting, fresh drinking water is a war crime if a full-on siege, but it's only vulnerable to siege if Ukraine can control all the way of Kherson, which is at the narrowest point about 100 kilometers at best in here. It's about that. It says 90 here, but I'll be off a little bit. That's at best, but it control these for siege, let alone needs the aspect to then target ferries, train lines, everything into here. And we have seen that the counteroffensive showed us the unrealistic nature of then being able to split that
to achieve its goals. The same aspects that make Crimea easy to fortify and therefore easy to keep Ukrainian soldiers out can also be used against Crimea to keep Russian soldiers in, or Russian people in general, and to prevent aid and supplies from getting to them.
So he speaks about Russian people, and this is one of the problems with Crimea, and we won't go down the rabbit hole of the autonomous republic in here, but of the population itself and where they see themselves and where they may want to become also is vastly different to the other areas of which Ukraine has been fighting in so far.
That is the real strategic way that people should look at Crimea in the long term and whether or not it could ultimately be taken. Not by the dynamics of how costly an invasion of Crimea would be, but rather by the dynamics of how vulnerable it would be to siege and how easy it would be.
But this is assuming that then Russia couldn't break that siege or continue supplying.
Opponent to actually achieve that objective. Historically, of course, this
and
idea...
saying that Russia would basically just up and walk out of that area. It's head in the cloud optimism, to quote himself.
...is well-trodden. Many of the world's most powerful empires, most powerful cities, ultimately succumbed to siege. Siege is one of the most tried and true historical tactics when it comes to war, and it's the tactic that, for a lot of people, is the easiest to understand.
Most of the time, or these historical examples, aren't taking into account when you have long-range strategic weapons to break areas too on very few supply routes in and out.
Easiest to execute against.
And a massively numerically superior force.
So when we look at Crimea, what we realize is that at the time of Ukraine's choosing, when they are ready to take...
At a time of their choosing, when they are ready...
Crimea back, they can probably cut off access to Crimea from every access point.
No, that they can cut off access to every access point. They may be able to. You bomb a train line, that's going to be back up within 24 or 48 hours. With the only way to seize and hold terrain is infantry, and that means Ukraine would have to have infantry on these areas and be able to hold it.
And destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge. They can lock off land access to Crimea.
Russia fully assumed the Kerch Strait Bridge would be down. That's why they've built a new train line.
Yeah, and they can prevent people getting cut off access to Crimea from every access point. They can destroy the Kerch Strait Bridge. They can lock off land access to Crimea.
Block off land access. Ukraine, through its best military, will have to try and do that. They tried to do that down to Tokmak in here to block this off and was massively unsuccessful. They're not going to be able to cross the Dnieper in here, to be able to dam Dnieper down into these areas. Again, but this, if Ukraine could get in and cut off and have physical soldiers and enough weapons to hold these train lines and bridges in here, maybe, and all the ferries crossing, yeah.
And they can prevent people getting to or from it via the sea, as they've already done to the Black Sea Navy. So the question you then have to ask is...
The Black Sea Navy still operate. It doesn't have the freedom of movement that it did, but it is still operating, and we still see cargo ferries, etc. moving.
Will Ukraine ever get to a point where it will be in a strategic position to do all of those things I've just listed?
Okay, will they get into a point? Here we go.
The answer to that question is, of course they could be.
Okay,
of course. Understand the war in Ukraine for what it is. And
okay,
not what
understand the war for what it is. Let's see what is said here.
People think it is, who are incorrect. Where the war in Ukraine is a war of attrition.
Correct. The war in Ukraine is a war of attrition. And by the figures that we have at the moment, Ukraine is not winning that war of attrition with a much smaller population. And we see that becoming and then turning into territorial ambition. Ukraine's ambition is territory. Russia's ambition is to reduce the potential of the Ukrainian state. So Ukraine's ambition is to take back the 1991 borders, therefore get into these institutions, NATO, etc. What Russia wants, they speak about territory because it's putting a goalpost on it, but what they really want, what Russia really wants, is to reduce or deny Ukraine potential. They want to deny NATO entry, deny the EU, and part of that is war. It's Clausewitzian. War is politics for other means. So they launch a war to influence politics, and territory for Russia is not a priority goal. It is a byproduct of that, but the product number one is to try and reduce the potential. And this is why we see, look at the front line from here, envelopment. You get my drift.
Where Ukraine's entire strategy is to lock into defensive positions.
Lock into defensive positions. Okay, this is Ukraine's strategy.
Hold for as long as they have to.
Hold for as long as they have to. Hold way too long in the areas like Avdiivka or Bakhmut.
And exert more casualties against the Russian military until ultimately...
Exert more casualties. Again, he's correct, and this is what Ukraine should be doing, but what we are seeing on the front line, from the fortifications to tactical decisions being reported from Ukrainian commanders and Ukrainian soldiers, this is not what is taking place. And that Ukraine exert more casualties on the Russian forces, they may do, but it needs to be at a factor of 3 or 4 to 1 to even be relevant by population. But it needs to probably be more like 6 or 10 to 1 to be relevant for recruitment of soldiers. Ukraine is now completely reliant on conscription. Russia is still completely just recruiting in. They're having an easier time. They're replacing way more on the front line than are being lost. So if you are replacing that, you are growing your forces. Russia has grown its forces through the year, while Ukraine is not only not then replacing its forces, but shrinking on the front line too. You have the imbalance is not just by population figure, it is more as well. Tachiragami Yue, that he put out that he believes it's probably in Ukraine's favour 1 to 1.8 casualty figures, which of course is nowhere near in the Ukraine's advantage in an attritional aspect of war. And the one being attrited is Ukraine by what we see of these envelopments and by Russia's strategy of the triple choke of holding. Pokrovsk is a great example of this. Holding them in place with drones, then targeting with then artillery like FAB glide munitions, barrel artillery, and then TOS in areas to attrit down and maximize that attrition.
Russia runs out of men or runs out of resources.
So when Russia runs out of men, runs out of resources, it's not 2022. If you were to look at this, NATO themselves, they are saying that Russia is growing its manpower, it's growing its resources as tanks, armoured vehicles, etc., to the point of which it may have a threat to NATO itself. That is what NATO and the leaders are saying, that the Russian military is still growing and expanding.
Send against them, and there's a potential break in the Russian economy, a potential break in Russian leadership.
So there's a break in leadership, break in economy. Again, this is not what we are seeing currently taking place. Look at the leadership issues at the moment. Which of the presidency has people on the street calling for his resignation or calling for changes?
A break in the Russian military's ability to continue fighting.
So again, focusing the war on a Russian failure rather than a Ukrainian victory by increasing the cost to that point. And this was a realistic strategy in the first years of this. But we have seen from time and time again, and the late withdrawal from areas, influenced a lot by bloggers online who refused to hold then the leadership to accountability, has caused Ukraine a huge rate of attrition, which is not, even if it is positive 1-to-1, it's not over that rate where the Russian military is the one that cannot recruit anymore or has a manpower crisis. Russian military is growing, is able to push on many different areas of the front line, stabilize and exploit areas as well. It is Ukraine who doesn't have the manpower and can't recruit the manpower or even conscript the manpower at this point.
I've mentioned this in past videos, but
and that this doesn't get better over time, it deteriorates over time.
And again, it's very similar historically to World War I, where the battle lines didn't change much until they did. Until Germany's economy broke.
Yeah, they didn't change much until it did. And what do we see is that Russia is making record gains month on month. This is my bankruptcy theory of little by little and then all at once. And this is pressure politically, diplomatically, militarily. That is what is taking place.
Down due to economic reasons, due to blockade.
So I guess the crux of this video is where myself and Mr. Warburg disagree, and I'm happy to discuss this with him, is that he believes Ukraine is winning the war of attrition and that Russia will break, and I believe that no, Russia is winning the war of attrition, and eventually we will start seeing breaks in Ukraine's line before Russia's. And I believe all aspects, depending on any lens we look through this, from recruitment to territorial gains to tactics to strategy to politics, I think that's where I am correct. Happy to be wrong.
The same type that we're talking about when it comes to Crimea, and Germany was ultimately forced to negotiate peace terms. When it comes to...
And then we have seen what then became of that in the decades following after then the Treaty of Versailles. But yeah, okay, I guess. Many would say it's more... The situation we're in geopolitically is more pre-World War II, maybe pre-World War I. I'd sort of say pre-World War II. But again... see the line not move much until it does. And this is exactly like the attritional warfare doctrine, protracted warfare doctrine I go through many, many times on my channel, where I say that then you look at the doctrine and after your initial attacks, then you need like a 2-year break to mobilize enough men, dig in, camouflage before the front line starts moving. Russia had a much more difficult time and Ukraine had much more resilience to then their attack than they thought in the first opening months. Then through 2022, mid to late 22, the Russian advancements basically stopped, if not retreated, withdrew into positions that didn't move for like 2 years. This is like bang, bang, bang on the attritional warfare doctrine. They focused in the economy to survive a protracted war and this replacing then ministers and then built massive lines, camouflage, mobilise a heap of guys, and then it starts moving. And the doctrine, literally, we've gone through the paint by numbers of you do this, your initial hostilities, then it stalls, then it's going to take 2 years to mobilise, dig in, etc. Then you go back on the offensive, and basically bang on 2 years, we started seeing that offensive crawl forwards again and increase in speed.
Ukraine's war against Russia, if and when they're able to achieve something similar against Russia, that is when the battle for Crimea would actually take place, not before. And so you have to look at Crimea as it will exist, not today, but how it would look after Russia's economy had broken down.
So this is a presumption, though, that Russia's economy breaks and the Russian military breaks, and then we can walk in basically bloodless into this area. But they are very, very large assumptions. And if you were to ask me right now, which military looks like it is more on the ropes, it's not the Russian military. And this is what NATO is telling us too, that they are a threat to then NATO at the moment, or will be in the coming years. That the longer this war goes on, likely, I believe, the worse Ukraine's position is becoming.
After Russia's military had broken down.
In 6 months, I believe Russia's going to be in a better position than it is now. And 6 months ago, it was in a worse position than it is now. And that will get in that way much more quickly.
And potentially, Russian soldiers no longer want to fight for Russia.
Russian soldiers now no longer want to fight for Russia. If you're talking about a morale crisis, again, it's not Russia that has that. No one wants to sign. Ukraine is not recruiting anybody. They are physically ripping guys off the street, while Russia, with incentives, is recruiting 30,000, 40,000 a month and losing less than that.
This makes Crimea's fortified position look a whole lot weaker.
And that there's going to be a morale crisis on Crimea's fortified position. Again, this is very, very down the line speculative.
Ukraine is, of course, not going to attack Crimea today for multiple reasons. First of all, that's just not Ukraine's style. That's Russia's style. Russia's style is to send tons of men and resources against heavily fortified positions and to break themselves against those positions. And Ukraine's style is to hold against them.
Russia's is not that. It is to, as per the map, is to outflank these positions with a large amount of resource, hold that, surround that resource. Ukraine's will hold that at all cost for far too long and attrit themselves in there. The ones in the kill boxes, per the maps, is not Russia. It is Ukraine.
There's also the fact that when we look at Crimea, we've already discussed that at this point in the war, it's not really strategically important. There is no longer...
It is strategically important. Incredibly strategically important. Otherwise, why would Ukraine have an interest in it?
A navy operating out of Crimea that is having any major impact on the battlefield. Ukraine has shown
the land-based assets, agriculture, etc., 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 in there, millions of people.
They can hit any target on Crimea with abandon, and they can basically control what happens on
the effectiveness of the missiles and drones has been limited, and it was incredibly successful and is limiting.
If they can't control the peninsula themselves. And so Ukraine will wait as long as they have to until Crimea becomes a more tenable target. And it could become a more tenable target simply due to...
But you can change this the other way and say that the war... This is assuming. It is assuming that time is on Ukraine's side. And my pushback on this is I do not believe by any metric that time is on Ukraine's side. And I believe that any serious military analyst behind the scenes who's maybe not appealing to an audience agrees with the time is not on Ukraine's side. And we see then the European leaders say that, well, Putin is extending the war. And they wouldn't say that if it wasn't in his favour to extend.
Or simply due to Russia negotiating it into the war, where they're actually forced to give Crimea back to Ukraine.
Russia negotiating an end to the war where they're forced to give Crimea back to Ukraine. Okay. I don't see any way that if Putin remains in power, the Kremlin is still there, that Crimea ever is negotiated back. Russia will just continue on the war.
Because Ukraine might just simply be able to put it under siege, and the Crimean people are not going to want to be part of that. On top of all of this, there is another factor that I haven't even mentioned yet.
Again, the Crimean people, they're not the ones who are fighting back either.
Which is that Ukraine's strategy as a military is focusing increasingly more and more on drones. And Ukraine is producing a huge surplus of these. It's
increasing reliance on drones due to the... it doesn't have the manpower not to. But drones... Nuclear bombs, I shouldn't say tanks, from drones to nukes to fabs to this, cannot seize and hold terrain. The only way to seize and hold terrain is men on the ground, and that will never be replaced until we have some Terminator style. And I actually believe Ukraine has a massive over-reliance on drones. Drones at the end of the day are targeted artillery. They are efficient, they are cheap, they are effective, but they cannot seize and hold terrain.
Drones with millions of them being produced by Ukraine itself every
So is Russia. Russia's producing thousands of Garans all the time, causing havoc, and has full factories set up as well to create FPV drones, and is ahead in then the fiber optic drone capacity and the long-range drone capacity.
single year. And that number is only increasing more and more and more and more, especially now with Europe and now even the United States looking to invest in helping Ukraine grow its drone production capacity. And not only is its capacity for large numbers of drones increasing, but the technology on those drones is increasing as well, and they're becoming more and more capable. Ukraine already eliminated the strategic importance of Crimea, the Black Sea Fleet, using drones.
It did not eliminate the importance of the Black Sea Fleet. The importance of Crimea is the ground being there and its future importance and access to areas. The Black Sea Fleet, well, how are missiles still being fired in? Those drone boats, yes, they created a massive headache for those, but we still see ships getting off missiles. And again, it increased Russia's costs, it decreases Russia's ability to fire missiles in, but in the day, it's still a ground war. And any of this doesn't matter the drones. Ukraine still needs to move from here all the way down into these areas to have a siege, or into here and siege for a long enough time. How long do you need to siege Crimea before then Russia give up? It's not going to be days, it's not going to be weeks, it's not going to likely be months, it might be years. And there's also laws of armed conflict that come into siege around certain items as well. Not that Netanyahu believes in that.
They've come a long way since then. So it's not inconceivable at all that Ukraine at some point in the very near future, when they are ready, could absolutely overwhelm the infantry defenses on Crimea as well. And they could use that
overwhelm the infantry defenses in the near
without
future.
having to have a huge costly assault on this fortified position. That is another option as well that could be used instead of or in combination with all the other strategies I've already discussed. So the important thing to note here is that Ukraine has options. And not only can they actually take Crimea, but there's multiple ways that they could actually achieve that.
They could take it. My crux of this is Ukraine currently cannot hold the front line. It is in losing the front line at an increasing rate month to month. I think it is very head in the sky to believe that then they are going to be holding Crimea, because the situation is going to get worse more quickly. And we're talking about an area of which, on the best time, when Russia was really on the ropes in 23, Ukraine had the highest morale, the best vehicles, it was going to have the best training, and it achieved this in here, let alone moving through all these. And the Russian military, you can say it in chorus again and again and again about it's going to collapse, blah, 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 blah. Month after month, year after year, we have not seen that. What we have seen is it grow in size, increase its tactical ability, which the tactical flexibility of the Russians has never been fantastic, but the Russians to the Soviets to pre-Soviet was slow to stand up, I guess. Again, it's not displaying this per what I am seeing.
And it does not have to be a heavily costly objective. So when you have politicians trying to pressure Ukraine into just submitting to Russia, when Ukraine is actually making heavy strides in the areas where they could actually achieve their objectives over the long term.
I don't know what strides they are making to achieve the objectives of 91 borders or Crimea at the moment, rather than just trying to hold on.
Well, we don't want to give up Crimea because we think we can actually take it back. Well, given all of these things we talked about today, now I hope you can realize who you should actually listen to. This is why it's so important to actually think critically about every single...
I guess listen to those that say this is realistic in the short term to take back Crimea. Again, given what has been spoken about, I guess the pseudo-environment that Mr. Warburg has set up around that, if you set the environment that Russia's economy is collapsing, their military is collapsing, and that Ukraine will take these back and that will have complete drone advantage over Crimea, I guess he is correct within that. And that's saying that the population then will be friendly towards that and stick up their hand and go, well, if it's been liberated, maybe so. But that, in that environment, I guess, is true. But that's not what I believe the war is actually showing us at the moment.
The aspect of this war is not just accept the first narrative you hear that seems to make sense at face value. Because nothing in this war is to be taken at face value.
Yeah, I agree. Nothing should be taken at face value.
Out those important facts that often sit below the surface. And if you want to support more of that, you can do so by becoming a patron of this channel.
And this is Mr. Warburg in here speaking about then what has taken place. And I get, yeah, like I like to go through this stuff. It's interesting, but in my opinion, that this is making massive assumptions that Ukraine is currently winning the war of attrition, that they're going to be in a better position week by week, month by month, year by year than they are now. That also that the US, Europe, whatever, doesn't have Ukraine fatigue and will continue supporting for years and years and years with these very lofty ambitions. And that is just not what I am seeing, both from a political sense to a military sense at all, by actual data, not just speculation. Kursk is a great example of the speculation is that Russia lost way, way more. The actual data suggests Ukraine lost more, at least vehicles in that area. And the nature of warfare tends to suggest that. And the nature of this warfare being attritional, being protracted, and the shaping of the front line, the disparity in long-range fires, medium-range fires, doesn't suggest that Ukraine is winning a war of attrition, as we see the territory then speeding up. And there's two very different wars being fought here. War of attrition and a war of territory. And that war of attrition is going into the reduction of potential. And that Putin knows all he has to do is reduce potential, and that will turn into gains rather than vice versa. If we take into account, if we want to talk history and we look at the 23 offensive and we look at the front line, it's not suggesting what I believe Mr. Warburg is suggesting at the moment, and politically isn't suggesting that there's going to be support of billions and billions and billions for years and years and years to come. Anyway, Legends, I hope that you are having a fantastic day, and I will speak to you maybe later on today. Okay, thank you very much. Bye-bye.